Welcome. On behalf of the Freedom School Project National Committee, the Rutgers Newark Urban Education Department, and the Joseph C. Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies, welcome to tonight's event. My name is Nikifa Bernard-Garay, Senior Program Director here at the Cornwall Center. The song you heard tonight was Keep Your Eye on the Prize by Sweet Honey in the Rock. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the native land that we are broadcasting from. In preparing for this part of this evening, I thought creating a land acknowledgement was simply a statement of reverence to the natives and tribal nations that inhabited our land before colonizers forcibly removed them. Yes, it is that, but there's also so much more. In my quest to create this statement, I learned a little bit about the native history of this land and the land that our panelists from the University of Florida are broadcasting from. More importantly, I learned that a verbal land acknowledgement statement is only one piece of this journey. Also important is the conversation about this important yet often portion of American history. We'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge the land that Rutgers University Newark sits on. We want to respectfully acknowledge the Munsee Lenape people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We would also like to acknowledge that this meeting is also being broadcasted from the University of Florida in Gainesville on the seized territory of the Patano and Seminole people. We pay our respect to the elders of those tribal nations, both past and present. Land acknowledgement is only the beginning, a small yet important step towards elevating our consciousness about America's relationship with Native people and this land. As a call to action, we encourage you to explore this some more on your own and consider beginning meetings with your own statement of land acknowledgement. Please check the chat now for a list of links and resources to help you on that journey. From there, you can look up which Native people lived on the land you stand on. Please also remember that we're in this together. Start conversations with folks in your network, link with others that have done land acknowledgements, connect with organizations and web resources to get started. Thank you to Paul Ortiz, Elizabeth Mange Pacheco, and Adelric McCain for their support in helping Cornwall craft tonight's land acknowledgement. Again, welcome to the inaugural virtual event of this year for the Freedom School Project. We are so excited to have you with us tonight. The Freedom School Project is an attempt to change the national conversation about education for the children of disenfranchised communities. We advocate for re-engineering some schools in such communities based on the principles underlying the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, SNCC Freedom Schools, and similar efforts, schools that approach learning as affirming, elevating, rigorous, joyous, and transformative for self and community. This past summer, we did a survey of members of our National Freedom School Project network. Participants were people like you, attendees of past events, and folks on our mailing list. Thank you to those of you that participated in our survey. There were two important highlights from that survey that I'd like to share. First, there was a widespread willingness of members to add their time, energy, and resources to this effort. We are so grateful for this support, and you should be hearing from us soon about ways to get involved. And second, there was a desire to better understand Freedom School curriculum and pedagogy. While there isn't one answer to point number two, tonight's session begins the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have Rebekah Anne Cordova and Paul Ortiz here with us to deliver their talk, placing African American and Latinx history at the center of the new Freedom School curriculum. Before we begin, I'd like to conclude with some intention setting for this new year of Freedom School programming. As we continue to gather and learn from our brothers and sisters on this journey, we can naturally become bogged down or discouraged by the heavy stories of struggle that run deep through our past and present. May our hopes of equity and justice never fade, and may today's stories of struggle be the seeds of wisdom for tomorrow's tales of triumph. Up next, Marquise Guzman, Senior Program Director of Neighborhood Partnerships and Executive Director of Newark Freedom School at 13th Avenue School. Marquise.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Paul Ortiz is the Professor of History and Director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. He is also a National Archives Distinguished Scholar with a focus on Latinx history. He is a first-generation college graduate and third-generation U.S. military combat veteran. He served with the 82nd Airborne Division and the 7th Special Forces in Central America in the mid-1980s. Paul received his PhD in history from Duke University in 2000. He earned his bachelor's degree from Evergreen State College in 1990 and his Associate of Arts degree from Olympic College in 1988. His pathway to academia included working as an organizer with the United Farm Workers of Washington State and the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. Paul is a PEN Award-winning writer, and he is the author and co-author of 5 books, including Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida, from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, and People Power, History, Organizing, and Larry Goodwin's Democratic Vision in the 21st Century. Dr. Ortiz's African-American and Latinx History of the United States was identified by Fortune magazine as one of the 10 books on American history that actually reflects the United States. Further, Bustle.com named it one of the 10 books about race to read instead of asking people of color to explain things to you. In 2019, Paul received the Cesar Chavez Action and Commitment Award from the Florida Education Association for outstanding leadership through engaging in activities which dignify workers and by making notable contributions to the labor movement and demonstrating resilience in organizing workers, especially those that have been traditionally disadvantaged. Paul has published several essays in the American History Review, Latino Studies, Cultural Dynamics, the U.S. Latina and Latino Oral History Journal, the Oral History Review, the Florida Historical Quarterly, and many other journals. This is in addition to several interviews on intellectual freedom, labor, politics, and the histories of social movements and immigration, among other topics. Dr. Ortiz has served as the former president of the Oral History Association and currently serves as the president of the United Faculty of Florida, UF, the union that represents tenured and non-tenured track faculty at the University of Florida. Dr. Rebekah Cordova is an educational researcher and teacher educator at the University of Florida. Dr. Cordova's areas of expertise are the history of schools and education, history of the South, justice-oriented teacher activism, and rural public pedagogy. Dr. Cordova is also the co-director of All Y'all Social Justice Collective, a praxis-based organization that provides no-cost teacher professional development to those who seek to better understand the needs, joys, and challenges of teaching for justice in the South. Her most recent text, Educating for Social Justice, Field Notes from Rural Spaces, was published by Sense in 2020. Dr. Cordova received her master's in education from the University of Florida and her PhD in education from the University of Denver. I now turn it over to Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Cordova.
Thank you, Marquise, for a very kind introduction. As you were talking, I started thinking, the main takeaway is this guy's getting old. There's a lot of things I'm thinking about as you're doing the introduction, but seriously, I'm really excited and honored to be here this evening, to be reunited with one of my former dissertation committee members at Duke University. And I was mentioning when we met earlier that I just consider it one of the great honors of my life to be able to have Charles Payne on my dissertation committee. Charles had just finished the incredible book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, on the freedom struggle in Mississippi. When he arrived at Duke, of course, everyone wanted to have you, Charles, on our dissertation committees. And so I'm just so grateful that you agreed to be on my committee. And I've just been following this initiative with a lot of excitement, participating as much as I possibly can. As many of you know, we are under siege in Florida. And in terms of academic freedom, in terms of even the idea of talking about freedom schools. So many of you know that the state has passed the so-called anti-woke law. They have banned critical race theory in Florida. They have banned the 1619 history curriculum. They have banned history that makes certain individuals uncomfortable. And we all know who those individuals are, because history, when I was growing up, constantly made me feel uncomfortable, constantly made me feel demeaned. I hear the same thing from students all over the country, but no one passes a law against great replacement theory, right? Which actually has cost lives, many lives, but they passed a law against critical race theory in Florida. I was just at the Race and Slavery Conference at Yale, sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute. And it was just on this incredible panel with people like Mia Bay, Erica Lee, Eric Foner. And, we talked about the challenges of how you continue to teach history, as a K through 12 teacher, as a community organizer. And it turns out the spaces that we have fought for and really earned and kept going in communities, in union halls, in community centers, in senior centers, in just, hangouts like the Eastside Cafe in El Sereno, or neighborhood associations in Pilsen, Chicago, or in the South Bronx, or in where my father's people are from in the 4th Ward in Houston, Texas, and Barbara Jordan's old congressional district. These are spaces that our ancestors and elders fought for, and that we're struggling to really maintain during this era of just fighting for the right to teach history and to talk about history, period. The good news is that there's just more interest in history than ever. Because this is a movement-centered gathering, I don't need to remind you that the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement literally created enormous new spaces for us to talk about histories of intersectional struggle, of survival, of resistance, of oppression. One example is that the first Hispanic Heritage Month for me, after the spring of 2020, when the resurgence of Black Lives Matter had happened worldwide, my Hispanic Heritage Month literally blew up. And I gave 3 times as many talks as I usually give during Hispanic Heritage Month, which for me has always been a busy month. And again, they were not just in the usual places. They were not just in universities. They were at union halls. They were at community clubs, organizations, places some I knew about, some I never heard of. There were a lot of high school students who were asking for me to come in and to give talks at their schools all across the country. I heard stories of students literally walking out of classes, going on strike. This wasn't covered in the media, but they were demanding a new kind of history. At the same time, we were fine-tuning in Connecticut. Many of you know that Afro-Latino, Puerto Rican, African-American students and their allies had fought for years for a breakthrough in the Connecticut public school system to incorporate African-American, Latinx, and Puerto Rican histories. That breakthrough happened a few years ago with the new public law, and I served as an educational consultant to try to create a curriculum that now is being actually learned by many high school students in the state of Connecticut. But again, it's the movement, it's the freedom movement that made the breakthrough in Connecticut possible. And so I just wanted to preface everything I said by saying that we understand as freedom, as heirs of the Freedom School legacy, if you will, that we're just as dependent on the power of the movement. And I remember something that C.L.R. James said in party politics in West Indies in the early 60s during the independence struggles in the Caribbean. And he said, the more active the people are, the more active the government can be. Now that can cut both ways because, I'm talking from Florida. Florida went red while a lot of other states held even or even went blue. And again, as you know, there's a lot of efforts to suppress freedom of speech down here. Before I start my slides, I just want to say a couple things about unions because I think it's very appropriate in terms of thinking about the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and what we've been able to do in Florida to keep critical race theory alive for now is that we've been able to use our unions. I'm the faculty union president at the University of Florida. I think Marquise mentioned we have fought tooth and nail with our administration and the state of Florida, and we'll continue to use our collective bargaining contract and our academic freedom clause within that contract to keep critical race theory, to keep the 1619 history curriculum alive, at least for now, in higher education. But I just want to let you know there's a constant struggle. But certainly without our higher ed union, the United Faculty of Florida, we'd be in really woeful shape down here. So I'm going to start by sharing just a few slides with you that kind of will give you a sense of the work I've been doing to help place African-American and Latinx histories at the center of different types of curriculum. As I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of talks for labor organizations, community groups, student groups, high schools, all of the above. And again, my life as a historian was completely transformed just a couple of years ago. Like many movement historians, I mentioned my Hispanic Heritage Month blew up 3 times as many events. My Black History Month blew up 3 times as many events, that first Black History Month after the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. To me, it signaled a tremendous opening that people at the grassroots are creating. Younger people, but also let's not cut ourselves, let's cut ourselves some slack, middle-aged and older people as well. I was doing book clubs and just trying to share as much information as I could in terms of intersectionality. And I wanted to start tonight by showing you some of those slides that I use. And these are part of larger talks, but because I know that many people here this evening know who these individuals are, I'm just going to kind of glance over them pretty quickly. I always try to start with art, poetry, visual art, spoken word, to remind people that in terms of African-American and Latino histories, expressive cultures are at the center of our identities. They're at the center of how we think about the world. In the South Bronx and where I grew up, actually my gritty shipyard town, in the mid-70s, they took instruments away from us, out of our schools. My school, they took all the instruments out in 4th grade because our school fell into arrears. Well, we started to double shift. It was run down. There was water coming in. I remember putting little buckets and pails in the middle of our classrooms, and it rains a lot in the Pacific Northwest. But when we lost our instruments because of lack of resources, it never occurred to us to do what our peers in the South Bronx and Queens and other boroughs in New York did, which was to create hip hop music. And I start with that example to remind people that regardless of where you are, there's a struggle that's going on. So Elizabeth Catlett is a person who was born in the US, but then creates so much of our iconic art about Jim Crow and resistance to Jim Crow in Mexico. She leaves the United States, she's harassed, she's constantly red baited. But when she goes there, she's adopted in Mexico City, and people ask her, please stay with us. We're honored by your presence, and she stays. Emancipation, this is another theme that I'm trying to emphasize, is really the theme of struggle, placing struggle at the center of the story. Otherwise, what are we doing? The takeaway for me is basically that none of the rights and innovations that we have that we currently enjoy were given to us by any founding fathers. In fact, just the opposite. The founding fathers would not have approved of this event this evening, by the way. They wouldn't have approved of any of us here having anything to say about the society. So how do we get there? How do we get here? We got here because of people like Elizabeth Catlett, because of people like Emancipation, who led a strike at age 22 of 11,000 workers in San Antonio, where a lot of my people are from, or my grandparents' people are from. And they still talk about that strike to this day. They fought police brutality. Many of the women were beaten, but they held strong. And this theme of struggle in art, in poetry and spoken word, I think is so very important. We began tonight with song. That's how schools should begin. That's how union meetings should begin. That's how freedom movement should begin, with song. Ideally, we're singing, we're joining together, we're remembering what Hollis Watkins has taught us in many different occasions, which is that singing together creates a sense of collective spirit and people really working together. Again, these images, and one could keep going with these images. One could talk about Langston Hughes, who writes "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" as he's passing in a train into Mexico to visit his father who's told other Black business people in the US, what are you doing in the US? You need to come to Mexico. That's a great example of intersectionality. Or Malcolm X. A lot of people don't know the many different struggles that Malcolm took part in. This semester, I'm teaching an African diaspora course, and when I show some of these different struggles, people are like, "Well, I didn't know Malcolm X was involved in labor, international protest, human rights issues." And I'm like, "Well, what did you think he was doing?" And my students were like, "Well, we just thought he was talking." I'm like, "Yeah, he was talking, but he was involved in these really critical struggles." Centering social movements, I believe, is really critical in the practice of Freedom School curriculum. When I look back, and we just have the incredible privilege of having Dr. Zohara Simmons, who was in the Freedom School movement in Mississippi. She was the leader of the SNCC project in not Hattiesburg, Laurel, Mississippi, worked with many people to develop the Freedom School curriculum. And unless we have movements at the center of that curriculum, I'm not sure what we're doing actually, because again, the idea is to show us and younger people and older folks how we've been active, how we've fought, how we've gained our rights, how we've made improvements in the society, and that these things were not just given to us. That's the emphasis in mainstream education, y'all. I don't want to offend anyone, but I grew up in that system. And I used to be a part of that system. And I have to struggle constantly to not get sucked into that system where we talk about what was given to us. I remember driving down the road one day, and it was an anniversary of the 19th passage of the 19th Amendment. And the announcer on the radio said, "Today's the day that the US gave women voting rights." And I was like, no, not again. Women were not given voting rights in the US. They fought for them. They were beaten, they were arrested, they were waterboarded, they were tortured. And again, these are the types of stories that you generally don't see in mainstream education. And this is where Freedom Schools, I think, the Freedom School approach is so absolutely critical. So in African American Latinx history of the US, I'm actually often asked to talk about one chapter or one part of the book. A lot of people dial into either the beginning of the book or the end of the book. It's quite interesting. But the last chapter, every chapter of the book is driven by a question or a series of questions. So one of the questions in chapter 8 of African American Latinx history of the US is, how does Barack Obama get elected? How does he become the first Black president? And I answer that in part by talking about the incredible momentum created by the largest general strike in the history of the Americas. Now, I often ask this question to labor folks. Hey, what was the largest general strike in the history of the US? And often people will say, well, the Haymarket, Seattle 1919, Oakland 1945 or 46. And I'll say, well, no, it was created like in our own lifetime. This is how invisible struggles become, y'all. We participate in the memory hole thing where we forget about movements that we even were a part of. I've done this myself. So there's so much great work that needs to be done with oral history in capturing and preserving the legacies of the 2006 general strike, because there was an activity in every community in this country. And as an oral historian, this is what I'm really kind of keyed in on, is how can we create a project where we can understand, can document the legacies of the unseen organizers who created the general strike. Chances are you probably don't know any people in these frames, in these photographs, people that I'm showing who are leaders of that strike. Most of them, you will notice, were and are women. The role that women are playing, especially Latinas, in moving up the ladder in leadership into labor unions is remarkable. It's transformative. I have former students now who are vice presidents, Latina women. Nady Dominguez, Leilani Montez is the vice president of a large healthcare union in New York. And they used this experience in 2006 as a foundation to become activists for the rest of their lives. So how do we tell their stories? How do we honor and respect their stories and share them with people who weren't part of that movement environment? This is just the table of contents for an African American and Latinx history of the United States. If we're going to talk about valuing Latinos and African Americans and placing them at the center, we got to do it from day one. And I start with the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence, talk a lot about Cuba in the early chapters of the book. Unless you do this, then my students have cued me to this over the years. And I know those of you who teach have heard the same types of things. My Cuban American students will often say, Professor Ortiz, we don't think Cuban American history started in 1959, did it? I'm like, no, it didn't start in 1959. It starts a long time before that. But you have to find a way to create narratives where people can see themselves. I mean, to me, that's so very important. That's why oral history is a great way to start a class. And I do this even in the University of Florida, which is pretty mainstream. What do you know about the Haitian Revolution? What do you know about the Mexican War of Independence? What do we know about the 2006 general strike? And kind of begin a discussion there. What do you know about the 1930s? What have you heard about the Great Depression? Just kind of throwing questions out so I know where students are. I've been talking about teaching about struggle, but teaching about oppression is equally different. Understanding how far we have had to come, stony the road we have trod, right? And so these are very difficult images. What I like about these in the context of a freedom school tradition is this is the Mexican freedom school tradition right here. You can walk down any medium-sized town in the city of Mexico and find these types of murals. Maybe not created in the 1920s and 30s and 40s like these were, but murals that tell the history of a town, of a political party, of a labor union, of women working. And the public history tradition, I'll call it, is something that people from Mexico and Latin America brought to the United States with them. I would place this in the freedom school tradition because of this reason. Libraries are great. Seminars are great. Museums are great. But the idea behind these murals is at one point in history, you could literally walk down the street and run into any one of these murals. Now, for preservation's sake, of course, they've been placed in museums in Mexico City. But back in the day, the idea was place our people's histories out of doors so that as you're walking down the street, you can run into a mural that tells the story of your neighborhood, of your people's struggle. Because if we don't tell the story in public, we will forget. And this public arts tradition in Mexico was transported to the US during the Great Depression. This is the origin of the WPA. Most Anglo-Americans have no idea when they talk about the WPA who to thank. And then again, many African-American artists like Jacob Lawrence, again, Elizabeth Catlett, Langston Hughes, the list goes on, go to Mexico to learn these traditions, to blend African-American, Latin American traditions together and get art out of doors. The issue of intersectionality, it works, again, it cuts both ways in terms of the struggle, but in terms of oppression as well. These are painful images. I just have this one. This is a sign that my father and his generation had to grapple with. Imagine how difficult it would be to be a parent and to have to raise your children when this is right in your face. It's always difficult to be a parent, right? But it's just really astonishes me that we've forgotten so quickly about the ubiquity of oppression, about the intersectionality of oppression and how it's always worked in this hemisphere. So I kind of pepper my presentations with these types of images to remind people this is where we've come from. These were battles we had to fight. And when we fought them not just thinking about us folk or our folk, to paraphrase Stuart Hall. We fought them thinking about how our struggles would impact other peoples. And from the book, this is one of my favorite examples. People ask me, what was your favorite piece of research that you did in writing this book or that article, what have you. But this is one of my favorite finds, if you will, was to go into the archive and to find that W.E.B. Du Bois had been asked in 1928 in the lead up to the National NAACP convention. There's a lot of correspondence about this, but people say, well, Dr. Du Bois, we've got to give people a reason to try to fight to regain the right to vote. And it's so dangerous. You could be beaten, you can be arrested, you can be killed for doing it. Can you come up with a series of reasons that the Negro should fight to regain the right to vote in 1928? And this is what he came up with. I'm not going to read this, but this is so beautiful. I've shared this with so many different audiences, and they've been so inspired, because Du Bois says in the longer speech, he says, yes, we care about our families, our neighborhoods, our communities, but we should also be caring about the corruption that our loss of voting has made possible in the society. We should be thinking about the imperialism that our loss of voting makes possible in the United States. This is a prelude to Black Reconstruction, of course, which is published just 7 years later, when Dr. Du Bois talks about it's the defeat of African Americans in the South, which enables US imperialism to grow much more muscular. But I love the phrase, the government of American banks, because many of you, this is where movement historians, freedom movement historians like Du Bois, who was persecuted by this government almost every day of his life after he gave this speech, this is where he was prescient, right? The New York Times just recently put out a series of how Wall Street directed the US to invade Haiti and to destroy its economy. And that's out there now. When Du Bois said it, when James Weldon Johnson said it, it was seen as a little edgy, but now it's in the mainstream. So thinking about kind of moving towards wrapping up, I just want to, again, us to think about the visual arts and how we incorporate those into a Freedom School curriculum, because there's so many exciting examples. And here, this is an iconic image from the Mexican War of Independence. And when you talk about intersectionality, think about what Jose Orozco is trying to do with this piece of art. And again, this is a mural. This is life size. This is enormous. And when you look at this, you think about, and if we were in much more of a dialogical space, I would just ask you, what do you see here? One of the things I see is this is a dramatic contrast to visual images of the American Revolution. This is dramatically different, because in these images of the Mexican War of Independence, and there are literally hundreds or thousands of them, the emphasis is almost always placed on what we now call intersectionality. The artist is saying, look, this is a revolution created by many different types of peoples: enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, peasants, religious Christians, anarchists, y'all. This is you see the skull and crossbones in the background. There's a wonderful kind of prelude to anarchism, but you see the torch, you see the sword, you see people carrying bows, you see people from kind of all walks of life who are kind of the sword bearers of the revolution. You don't see that in art about the American Revolution. And so that's one of the things I try to really accentuate when I talk about African-American and Latino histories, and really the ways in which we have been brainwashed, propagandized. I play with my audiences, we talk about the Underground Railroad, and I'll say, well, if you're an enslaved African-American and you're in, in South Texas, what's closer to get to freedom, Canada or Mexico? And people look at each other, and we play with that. And I'll say, look, when I was in your seat, when I was in high school, it didn't occur to the obvious didn't occur to me. The obvious is that Mexico is much closer to Texas than Canada is. Mexico is much closer to Louisiana, to Mississippi, even to Florida. And these traditions of freedom that Mexico and the Mexican people establish just enraged the United States. Congressmen are trying to sue the government of Mexico for the loss of their property, as they call it, because so many enslaved African Americans are making it to freedom in the years after Mexico abolishes slavery, even before Mexico becomes a nation. Again, kind of thinking about wrapping up here, the histories of struggle. Where do we get what we have? And we can do this with so many different figures. Here I'm looking, thinking about Dolores Huerta, who was our Women's History Month speaker. I interviewed her. I've interviewed Dolores a few times. It's kind of a little awkward because I train as a labor organizer under her. And so you can imagine trying to interview her. She decides what questions she's going to answer well in advance of the interview. I'm just kind of there for window dressing. But imagine being 58 years old and being beaten so severely by the police that you're hospitalized. To me, this is a personification of our histories, of where we've come from, of what we have to do to just simply survive in this country. Maybe some people can take their rights for granted. We cannot. And I would argue a freedom school curriculum really, again, has to begin from that vantage point. What about the whole issue of citizenship? What about the whole issue of the rights of workers? And just a few more slides to share from you. These were newer research findings this summer in the National, Marquise mentioned the National Archives project I'm working on with Ibram Kendi. In African-American Latinx history of the United States, I kind of found, and again, based on other people's works, based on some primary research, we're rediscovering this long, amazing history of Mexican and Mexican-American abolitionism and anti-slavery movements. We're just really beginning to come to grips with these. One of the people, Jose Manuel Gallegos, who was a fierce opponent of slavery in New Mexico territory. He was also the first Hispanic elected to a territorial government in the United States. He constantly had opposition because so many powerful people in New Mexico territory before the war were pro-slavery. And Gallegos was so anti-slavery, and again, I'm not going to read these quotes here, but basically he gets up and he gives these incredible, powerful speeches against slavery. But one of the things I'm emphasizing, and again, I've just kind of, again, rediscovered this person, is that these are all given in Spanish. As far as I can tell, Jose Gallegos maybe spoke 5 or 6 words of English his entire life. And so most of his works that we find are in Spanish, and then we translate them. But I think it's really important to remind audiences that Spanish is a language of liberation, because we often forget that. And it's important to try to get people to remember things like that. Gallegos was kidnapped by the Confederacy during the war. He was a POW, so he paid severely for being on the side of freedom. But also Reverend Lena Mason. In African-American Latinx history of the US, I talk about telling each other's stories, telling each other's freedom struggles. If you've read the book, you know Reverend Mason is talking about the role of women in the Cuban freedom struggle. It's a very important story. And I'll conclude here with Mickey Leland. This is a family story because Mickey Leland, this was Barbara Jordan's district. Mickey Leland represents a district that part of my family hail from in Harris County. But getting up and actually saving the provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And what he did was, in the middle of this debate where we were in danger of losing the foreign language provisions of the Voting Rights Act at the height of the Reagan era, he gets up and he's speaking, and then all of a sudden he code switches, and he switches from English to Spanish. And what he says in Spanish is, you people should be ashamed. You think you're better than those of us simply because of the language you speak. That's not right. And he's so shamed, he shocked people so badly that apparently, I'm still trying to find out about this whole sequence. He shocked people so badly, other Congress people got up and started speaking other languages. one congresswoman started speaking Italian. It was like going to an evangelical Christian meeting where they're speaking in tongues. But the takeaway was save the voting rights, foreign language voting rights provisions. And I think a great example of intersectionality. So I'm going to stop talking now. As you can kind of tell, I could talk forever about this history, but I want to give the floor to my remarkable colleague, Dr. Rebekah Cordova. Hey, Rebekah, are you still on?
Then you may be muted.
No, I'm here. I'm just trying to be able to have permission to start my video. Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Give us 1 second, just having a few technical difficulties.
Cool.
Awesome, Rebekah, you're good.
Okay. Oh, all right. So Zoom still says I can't start my personal video, and that's fine. No need, but it does allow me to share the screen. So hopefully Ahmad, unless you can fix that, this is good. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending this panel presentation, and thank you, Dr. Ortiz. My name is Rebekah Cordova. I am the co-director of the All Y'all Social Justice Collective and an education researcher at the University of Florida. And so I'm here to just basically pull a bit from what Dr. Ortiz talks a significant amount about, which is a significant amount of content, a significant amount of work around the curriculum and the history content that we really want to have not only be present in classrooms, but kind of used as a lens for how we discuss not only historic events, but contemporary events, right? So I'm here to talk a little bit about what our organization does in terms of supporting the actual praxis of that work in particularly Southern classrooms, but of course, all over the country as we can. So some folks might know who we are if you've been to any of our conferences. But I just wanted to talk very briefly about what the All Y'all Social Justice Collective is. So we are a collective of primarily, we have a core group of folks that do a lot of the organizing work, and then we have kind of an external layer of people in our greater community that of course participate and help us do community organizing as well. But the core group are folks that are public school teachers and faculty members across the South. We are a Southern-based organization. That's something that's very strictly part of our organizational philosophy. So the faculty members that we pull from are from the College of Charleston, the University of North Florida, University of North Georgia. University of Florida is our home base. We also have folks in other parts of the South and smaller community colleges as well. And then, of course, our outer layer is basically anybody that's considers them a Southern education community member who works daily to disrupt injustice within schooling. So we have a core group of folks that do the work around the professional development, and then we're open to anybody that wants to be part of our community work. So our goal is basically twofold. Our primary material influence on communities is to provide relevant and engaging justice-oriented professional development for teachers where they don't have to pay. So we do that by providing yearly conferences, and then we also do workshops, professional development trainings. We support other types of events and experiences through either labor or money, but we mostly want to make sure that we are able to support educators in classrooms, do the kinds of justice work that they believe needs to be done so that they don't feel so alone in it. And then a larger aim that always guides our work is to redistribute academic money and resources from universities to our Southern communities. So what that means for us is that if you're an educator and you're a teacher and you're in a classroom and you're looking for some you're in the South or maybe anywhere, and you're looking to engage in professional development work at a university, universities charge for that significant amounts of money. And so where we basically originated from was this idea of, if the University of Florida is going to charge a district in Charleston or New Mexico or Colorado, University of Florida does work all over the country. If they're going to charge a district $500,000, $300,000 to provide professional development training, basically what that means are two things. One is that you can't, as a teacher, access that information unless your district has the money to participate in it and pay for it. And then two, even if your district has money, if you're not a large enough district, if you're a rural district or a small district, you can't really even opt into those sessions, right? You can't be just a one-off or a 10-person group. So as faculty and scholars, we became across the South very disappointed in our university's service to communities. We felt like as if our universities were charging for access in where we were supposed to be serving our communities. So we basically created a collective where faculty just, we create scenarios where we just give away what would otherwise be charged for. So we present the same professional development that the universities will pay districts will pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for. We present that same professional development for free once a year to people who can come to our conferences. So our goal is to redistribute resources back into the community through our own agency and our own intellectual capacities and ownership of our work. So we want to make sure that whatever we do is always free. People never have to pay for anything that we provide, and that's obviously very important to us. So since 2007, we've served over 400 educators just through our professional learning experiences. We travel around the South specifically in order to highlight not only the social justice work that's happening here within schools, but also we talk much about the challenges and the needs of Southern schooling, the unique history, the unique challenges, the unique ways in which our work can feel very not supported. I think the South in a lot of ways can be disregarded as a place that's a lost cause or not worthy of support or not worthy of examining, when in reality it's a significantly diverse group of states and communities. And then the work that gets done in the South is tremendously rich and amazing and beautiful. So when we do our conferences, we basically have a few requirements. And one is that you can't present unless you're from the South. So we welcome people to our conferences to learn from the South. So if you want to learn about justice teaching and you want to learn about what it means to do this work in the classroom, you're going to be coming to learn from Southern educators instead of Southern educators feeling like they have nothing to say. So just a few little notes about the kinds of things that our conferences provides. This 2020 conference sadly was postponed because of COVID, but we spent a lot of time seeking out community. We see communities as experts of knowledge, so we always have community experts and community members as our keynote speakers. You can see here in 2020, our work was going to be in Charleston, and we were going to have Dr. Millicent Brown. We spent a lot of time really wanting community members and teachers to engage with each other so that teachers see themselves as learners in ways, and that they don't always see themselves as learners. And so they're learning from the community, and the community has the opportunity to educate teachers about what the community is looking to be seen, how they like to be seen, and how they would like their community to be taught. Here's just a sample of some of our other sessions that we've had in the past. You can see that we try to make a pretty diverse groupings of people who are more traditional academics, who are professors, also coupled with, teachers who are in the classroom. We've also had several workshops where young people have led workshops. In fact, our last conference, we had 3 students from Alachua County in Florida present about what it was like to be a middle schooler and identify as Black in Alachua County, so they could basically tell their story to community members and teachers. And these were students who were 11 and 9. So we really try to prioritize people who want to be in community with each other, teach each other, and so that we can kind of grow out. That's our pretty large goal. One of our conferences was in Dahlonega, Georgia. So we move around the South. We're not always in major cities. We try to be in rural areas as well. So we were in Dahlonega, Georgia, where we spent a significant amount of time talking about the rural South and its stereotypes around who lives in the rural South and who doesn't, who is historically considered a hillbilly and who is not. What does it mean to have a racialized existence in the rural South? So our conferences also showcase a lot of multimedia arts, movies, plays, anything that we can do to really ignite these dialogues around what is justice work, what is curriculum, what does it really mean to embody these histories in a liberatory way. And that's, of course, never only isolated to traditional lectures in the classroom. And then lastly, we always try to do something that's very like healing, right? Because this work is incredibly taxing on the body, on the mind, on the spirit. And so we never try to just dismiss this idea that as people who do justice work and curriculum work in schools in liberatory fashions, that it's just something you can just keep doing over and over and over again without pausing to rest within community. So we always try to do some type of session that's around healing, that's around reflection, around self-care, boundary setting, community organizing with, kind of this intent around, healthy ways in which we do this work. So we really believe that in addition to talking about curriculum and talking about these histories that are so important in these liberatory settings, we can't ignore the fact that the human part, right? The part that is so incredibly exhausting, that we need to attend to our mental health needs, our spiritual health needs, our physical health needs, or we can't keep going. That's a pretty big part of what we do as well, especially for teachers who are at all points in time being asked and to do more and more and stretched so thin. So I wanted to at least share that too, that this is an important part of what we ask people to do is self-reflect on how are you taking care of yourself so that you can keep going and you can support other people who are continue to keep going. We can't have these conversations if we're not also talking about self-care and community care as well. So that's pretty much, I can stop there given that it's 8:02. But in short, in terms of, the curriculum pieces, it's also the conditions, right? We can have the best, most incredible pieces of curriculum, the lesson plans, we can know all of the content, the dates, the histories, we can feel really embodied in them. But it's really about creating also the conditions, the pedagogy, the praxis, the parts and the pieces of us that can keep going. And then of course, building community, because that's one thing that the collective really wants to do is teaching can sometimes feel very isolating. And you can feel very lonely at times. And so what are the ways in which we can always be a place of support and provide that kind of that safe space to just be, when you need to just be. That's one thing we hear pretty consistently at our events, is that teachers feel like they can just breathe, they can just be themselves, their full selves, because a lot of times they go back into their schools and they feel like they can't be their full selves. So, and it's hard to do justice work when you can't be your full self. So obviously our collective is primarily identifies working in the South because that's where a lot of our focus is. However, as I would say most people probably know, as Florida goes much of the country in terms of education policy. So what we're facing, what our neighbors are facing is not isolated to us. No matter how many times people want to just see the South as a place that is its own thing that won't impact other parts of the states. Historically, we know that that's not true. Florida is a giant state, and it will continue to have an impact. So I say all this as a scholar who is significantly worried about my state and my home, but also wants people to know that this is something that will affect all of us. So organizations, communities, people working in solidarity are definitely going to have to reach out and work collectively to make sure that this doesn't continue to spread further than it needs to go. In terms of the kinds of resistance to justice work that we're seeing, we're doing our part. And hopefully everyone's doing their own part, and love to be able to work side by side with other people who are doing their parts in other states. And I'll just stop here and hear from Ahmad about what he would like me to do next.
Actually,
Yeah, Charles, I'm sorry if you want to go ahead.
yeah, I'll start. I mean, I just want to thank the two of you. Those are two very stimulating talks, but also very complimentary talks. On the one hand, Paul makes it very clear how much even those of us who spent a considerable amount of time studying social justice history, how much there is to learn when you begin asking a different set of questions about how various histories which have been separate come together and intersect and cross over. One, there's that. And then there's this other story, the complementary story from Rebekah about what happens when we move into classrooms and actually try to teach that. So we actually have questions in the chat already, and questions and some interesting comments as well. But I am going to take advantage of the fact that I have the microphone, so to speak, and I would like to ask each of you to respond to one question apiece, right? So, Paul, I'm going to the introduction to your book, and partly it's the language that you use that I find interesting. And I just want to put some of the language on the table, but then there's a question at the end. Quoting, "This is a story about how people across the hemisphere wove together anti-slavery, anti-colonial, pro-freedom, and pro-working class movements against tremendous obstacles." I just like that language, right? And then you go on to make the point that we've all been overtaught on Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and ask the counter question, and I'm quoting again, "How does our interpretation of American history change when we take our cues from organizers such as Cuba's Jose Marti, Jamaica-born Amy Jacques Garvey, and the abolitionist Reverend Henry Highline Garnett, as well as the movements that they were part of, right?" And I know that you gave examples that could be considered responses to that question, but I just want to ask you to say anything else you want to say in response to that question. How does our interpretation of American history change when we take our cues from these people? You're muted. You're good.
I've learned after 3 years, unmute. Well, yeah, it's a great question, Charles. And it's one, writing this book was very humbling for me because I was asked by Beacon Press to essentially, write, revisit or revision U.S. history from roughly 1776 to present, but do it in less than 200 pages. So I'm like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. But what was humbling about it, Charles, was going back and looking at moments I thought I knew about, or movements or events. Reconstruction was lesson number one, because as I went looking over even the dissertation I wrote on the Black freedom struggle in Florida, looking at some of the early the colored convention movements in Florida, in Louisiana, and Mississippi, the first thing that struck my attention was, oh my gosh, they're constantly talking about Cuba or Brazil or like serfdom in Russia. I'm like, serfdom in Russia?
Mm-hmm.
These are people who are under siege. They're fighting the Klan. They're fighting for the right to vote. They're fighting for land. And at the same time, they're thinking about what freedom would look like in a global context. And that, as you know, Reverend Garnett and people like him, Bishop Turner, Frederick Douglass, so many others said, who would we be as a people if we celebrated at this moment? This is not the right moment to celebrate. This is the beginning of a global liberation struggle. And I just found that over and over again. And it made me wonder, like, what did I miss the first time through? Because all of these, it wasn't like I was finding brand new individuals. A lot of these are individuals that have been written about extensively in US history. I mean, another example is, what does it look like if we change the lens? I think of Frederick Douglass. And one of the other, I talk about Douglass in the introduction, and one of the speeches that he gave about why does the Civil War start? And this has become, as Rebekah knows, in the South especially, such a charged question, right? And the answer to it is supposed to be different than it was 10 years ago, but Douglass doesn't even mention, I mean, he's giving a talk in 1862. And it's kind of do-gooder folks up north. And they're asking him to kind of, raise their spirits in this fight against the Confederacy. It's the second year of the war. It's bloodier. It's longer lasting than anyone thought it would be. But as we all know by now, they should have known back then, if you want to invite someone to come and give you a feel-good talk, you don't invite Frederick Douglass. Right. Wrong person to invite. So he brings it. He brings the history. And he's like, white Northerners love you all, but you brought it on yourselves. You invaded Mexico. You attacked the Seminoles. You refused to extend diplomatic recognition to Haiti and to Liberia. So in other words, he internationalizes the struggle from day one right away. And so that pushed me, Charles, to go back and to reread W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. And that, to me, the Douglass quote is, to me, the key to a new way of understanding history. It's what I talk about when I mention emancipatory internationalism, because again, Douglass is not saying this is about us people or us folk. This is about our freedom as a people in connection to the freedom and oppression and liberation of other people. But it gets us so far away from the Abraham Lincoln as the emancipator and all this stuff.
Okay, very good. That's very helpful. But Rebekah, I mean, I know that you've taught in many different parts of the country. One of the questions that keeps coming up on this network, I'm going to say one of the concerns that keeps coming up, is what is happening to teachers who are trying to teach a more truthful history, the kind of history that Paul is advocating. So I know that you can speak to that from several different experiences. Anything you would like to tell us about what you want people to know about what's going on? What are teachers confronted with, subtle or not?
I think I've been teaching teachers for, this will be my 15th year, working with educators across the country. And I've spent years doing work in Washington State, and I've done work in New Jersey, and I've done work in DC, Colorado, Georgia. And as much as the context is different, the history is different, the ways people racially and are socialized and see themselves or other people see them can be different. In terms of schooling, there are some pretty significant threads that still remain pretty consistent. And so I would say that in Florida and in other big parts of the South, there's some unique challenges. That's just the fact. But I wouldn't say that they're so unique that they're so different than the challenges in other places, especially in rural spaces. Lots of times rural spaces like rural Florida will have a lot in common with rural Vermont and have a lot of common in rural Washington, more than I might have in common with Miami. So rural spaces can have a lot of similar challenges. City spaces can have a lot of similar challenges, depending on their history and depending on their unions and their state. But what I see the most is fear. And that's a predominant thread. Fear of what will happen if I say this, fear what will happen if what I teach this, fear of who will think this if a student asks this question. And then also, I think some shame and then some uncertainty. There's a lot that teachers don't know. And so if a lot of times teachers know, hey, I'd like, and as a history professor, a lot of times teachers will say, well, I just will teach whatever the standards want me to teach. And sometimes they don't know that content. And a lot of times if they don't know the content, they'll just try to do the best that they can because they're stretched incredibly thin. But if the content requests something that's, challenging, like, for example, in Florida, it's required that we teach about the Ocoee massacre here in Florida, but almost nobody actually teaches it because there's no accountability for that. Teaching about racialized violence is incredibly difficult, and it's not something that we do in teacher licensure programs very often. It's not something we talk about in professional development, and you definitely don't know what to do if a parent gets upset, if a student is confused, if you don't know what you're doing. It's one of those situations where we'll spend millions of dollars talking about a phonics programs until people are just, exhausted about it. But we won't spend any money talking about, what types of praxis or pedagogical shifts do we need to talk about racialized violence? Like we don't pay the same types of attention to that type of professional development. So educators have to do it on their own, right? And a lot of educators do it on their own for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because it's who they are and it's something that they live in, and so they don't see it as a choice. Sometimes they don't live in it, but they believe it needs to be, so they'll seek out professional development opportunities. But these are above and beyond what the profession asks of them. So the threads that I see, no matter where people is fear, worry, isolation, and even in the most incredibly supposedly liberal and progressive spaces, I'll see teachers are ready to do the work, wanting to do the work, desperate to do whatever it takes. And I'll see administrators have the fear, have the worry about their jobs, about politicians, about funders, about, who knows what, right? And so, unfortunately, this is not a thing that's isolated to the South or isolated to conservative spaces or rural spaces. This is everywhere. There's some type of thread that I have seen everywhere around how do we actually do justice work in curriculum and teach histories in ways that are not just about content. Because I think one of the greatest pieces of Paul's book and other books is that this is not just content. This is basically saying, here's content, and then here's how you can see yourself in it. Here's how you can see yourself in labor movement, in social justice movements, in global ideas, right? Like that, and then now you have to do something, right? Because teaching content is not hard. What's actually scary and what people are scared of is what students might do with that knowledge. Don't want students to do things with that knowledge. So that's where the fear is, and that fear is everywhere across the board. So our work, and hopefully everybody's work, is really pulling the threads away from the fear, like unraveling it, right? Like, how do we unravel the fear? It shows up in different spaces. It manifests differently everywhere. But books like Paul's book demand that you face things and then think about what you do now with that information now that you know it.
Apropos of what you were saying earlier about how you see the same kinds of pressures in different guises in different parts of the country. In New Jersey, we have a very, very progressive curriculum law, the Amistad curriculum, mandating the teaching of African American history, and virtually no one teaches it. but we do have the law, and that has to do in great part with a certain kind of fear, maybe not exactly the same kind, but with a certain kind of fear. So I'm going to stop. I think we want to come back maybe to a question about what concerned people can do about supporting teachers at the end, but we have a number of questions in the chat. So Ahmad, Marquise, do you guys want to start us on those questions?
Yes, absolutely. So our first question came from Camilla Green. She asked, in 2022, how can we best address the issue of anti-Blackness sentiment in the Latino diaspora? A lot of Latinos choose to be white adjacent and are harmful to Black and brown people. Whites and others believe that Latinos cannot be racist.
It's a great question, you know, and Camilla, I was mentioning earlier that my first Hispanic Heritage Month after the Black Lives Matter resurgence just blew up. And one of the things with especially with Latino or Chicano or Puerto Rican organizations, and I see it, I'm going to anticipate a question a bit later in the chat. So I do these types of talks and groundings and workshops with communities all across the country. And of course, almost in every case, I'm an outsider, right? I'm a person who's called to come in and to talk. That first, especially, and even since that time, but especially that first Hispanic Heritage Month after the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, one of the #1 topics I was asked to talk about was exactly this topic. Talk to us, Professor Ortiz, about anti-Black racism in our community, in New York, in Miami, in Los Angeles, in Seattle. So it requires me to do a little bit of homework because I know about anti-Black racism in some of those places, but less about others. But I can tell people, I mean, here's one anecdote to share with you. So when I first moved to Florida, I got a big wake-up call. And the wake-up call was I think it was thanks to the folks at Gilder Lerman who were asking me to go down to Miami-Dade, or it was Hialeah High School, or maybe Miami Senior High, great schools. And I was asked to go down to give history talks, especially on Latino history. And I'll never forget the first talk that I gave, because it was a combined audience of teachers and high school students. It may have been at Miami Senior, I don't remember. But anyway, I'm giving this talk and I'm showing some of the murals that I just showed to us this evening. And I hear these gasps in the back of the class. And I hear people kind of shuffling in their seats, and I know something's going on. And it sounds like it's productive because people are getting upset. And someone raised their hand and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Ortiz, you're showing us murals of Spanish soldiers burning alive our ancestors. You're showing them enslaving people, branding people. We were not taught any of this in school. We were taught that the Spanish were the kind colonizers, were the kind conquerors, and we were taught that in contrast, the British and the French and the Dutch were the beasts, were the brutal, they were committing a genocide, but we were taught that the Spanish were trying to bring us into their civilization very gently." And I said, oh, thinking to myself, we got some work to do here. Because if I'm honest with myself, I grew up in a school system which didn't teach really that much different, except it taught the flip side. It taught, because I grew up in the Northwest, they taught there that the British were enlightened and the Spanish were terrible, the so-called Black legend, right? And so, but see, this is where so many schools are kind of stuck now. They're stuck in this mode where, how could we teach about anti-Black racism if the baseline is so very low? Like right now, I'm teaching a book, The Farming of Bones, by Edwidge Johnnicott, the great Haitian-American writer. And she's talking about the 1937 Parsley Massacre, where this homicidal maniac, Rafael Trujillo, thanks to US support, takes control of the Dominican Republic and massacres tens of thousands of Haitian migrant workers. And my students are stunned, but the Dominican students know, the Haitian students know. And so the challenge is how to get this information out there when we have so little understanding of things like imperialism, of colonialism. But my argument is you've got to start there, and you've got to admit that the US is at the center of this. The US is an imperial power. But it can be done, but there is a lot of work. But again, I'll conclude by this part by saying that the inspiring thing is to see so many Hispanic, Latinx, Chicano organizations coming to the fore. And I saw the comment about the shameful statements made by the LA City Council people about Black and Indigenous people. There's a much different reaction to that now than there would have been 10, 15 years ago. And again, I think it's because of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Rebekah, did you have a response to that question as well? Or did you want to have anything to add?
No, I'm happy for us to keep going if you'd like to keep going through the questions.
Awesome. So the next question comes from Paul Robbins, and this one is specific to Professor Ortiz. What do you conclude is the critical element that ties the African American and Latinx communities into united action?
I think the critical element, and you know, I give this talk, it's interesting. I have a sequence of slides that begin with Hispanic Heritage Month at the front, and then a sequence of slides that begin with Black History Month. And they're actually the same exact images. They're images of 4 different individuals. Ida B. Wells Barnett, Reverend Lena Mason, I showed earlier, Jose Marti, and Antonio Maceo, the great Afro-Cuban general. And I use those 4 individuals, whether I'm talking about Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month. And I always start those talks with the realization and the admission that our peoples are so diverse. Like there's no such thing as one Latino people or even one Mexican-American people. We're incredibly diverse, but there's certain commonalities. There's commonalities between the groups, and here's the big commonality. We are working class people, y'all. If we don't work with our hands now, our parents did, our grandparents did. Many of us are 1 generation removed from the land. My people are. I mean, yeah, I'm lucky to be a university professor now, but my father has a 7th grade education. He had to leave school to help support his family. And because we're working class peoples, there are certain commonalities. One of those is we move a lot. We have to move a lot. Another one of those is we have to fight for everything we have. And so I kind of start there, if that makes sense, with that, the kind of, because I'm kind of secretly, Charles knows this because he remembers me when I was a grad student, I'm always trying to get labor history into the picture as well. Who does the work? Who benefits from the work? Why are some people rich? And why are our people so poor? Those are questions I grew up with, and I have not found satisfactory answers in the academy. And unless, again, we can change the narrative somehow.
Thank you, Professor Ortiz. The next question is actually specifically for you, Rebekah, and it comes from Camille Green. Context matters. Latinos in the southern states show up differently than the Latinos in Lehigh Valley, PA, than Latinos in the South Bronx. How do we navigate the different Latinx experiences of identity and liberation from white supremacy culture?
It's a really important question. I mean, I would say that from my perspective, and I think something that teacher educators should really grapple with, is we really need to understand histories in order to navigate that, right? As somebody who spent a long time in Colorado getting my PhD, understanding how people talked about their people, our people, in a way, the language they use, the ways they would talk about it, the migration patterns, and then moving to Florida and then living in Miami was a shock. It just personally was a complete shock. This was just a very different for me understanding of what it meant to be a Spanish speaking person, right? So understanding context, you can't do that without history, right? You can't understand why you're in Miami and it's where, if you're in Denver and you know how people identify as Mexicano or Chicano, is those aren't terms that in Miami I would hear very often. And the kinds of Spanish that people spoke in Miami and the histories of people who spoke Spanish who identified, as Cuban, and the ways in which they spoke about people who identified as Mexican were very different than I had ever experienced in my life in Colorado or in the West. So, but you can't make sense of any of that without understanding history. At least I don't believe you can. You need to understand people's narratives, their families' narratives, and not just that, but the land, right? How we interact with the land, how we interact with migration, how we interact with language. We have all these connections. But a lot of these connections are through colonization, and a lot of these connections are through white supremacy and the actions of white supremacy. And then, of course, a lot of the tension and violence and bigotry and racism is also through white supremacy. So I would say that there's not a monolith, and that's one of the biggest issues at hand that we talk to teachers a lot about. Like, how do you do both and? How do you, in one hand, understand a socialized, racialized experience of people, that where there may be commonalities and threads and things that bind people together, and then how do you not essentialize? How do you understand the significant depth, the richness, history, and ways in which people are so incredibly different culturally, linguistically, depending on so many complicated things. And much of it is regional. Much of it is regional because it matters with migration, it matters with language, and it matters with community. Who you're in community with, who you're in solidarity with, will shape how you see the world and then how the world sees you. So in terms of like how we do that, like clearly there's no like really one solid answer, but in terms of how we work with teachers in that way, like we do a lot of that work in the collective. And it's really about, like, for example, in Florida, you know, people will still identify as Hispanic. This is not a term that in other states I've worked in that people would identify with kindly, right? So I have this conversation with teachers a lot around, you know, why is that? What is the power dynamics? What are the history around this terminology? And how can you, as an educator, somebody that is largely in the service of students and families, like, you need to be in the constant high, like the most intensive self-awareness space you can possibly be. Constantly self-aware, constantly learning, constantly intellectually and spiritually and emotionally curious, because there'll never be a space where you know everything. There just won't, especially in this kind of a context around a racialized or ethnic identities of students, of communities. We come into it so much with our own ideas. If you don't know yourself and you're unwilling to be curious about yourself, then it's really hard to be curious about other people. And so the short answer would be fostering this idea that our work together in solidarity is not static, it's dynamic, it's ever growing, it's ever shaping, it's ever changing. And the more you can challenge your own self to be humble in that process, the best space teachers can be, right? Because it's a humbling experience to learn. It's a humbling experience to have a parent or a student teach you and tell you something that you need to know. And if you are not humble, then you can't hear them. And if you can't hear them, then you're never going to be able to see the context. You're never going to be able to understand the histories. You're never going to be able to see people for themselves. So navigate the experiences of people, that requires the most vulnerable state. And so my question back to us is, how do we foster a vulnerable state for educators to live within? Because we're doing everything but that. Like, there's nothing vulnerable that's allowed for an educator to be. So in my opinion, in order to do all of this really well, we need to create conditions for educators that absolutely either do not exist at all or rarely exist. So we can have all of these great answers, but if we don't foster a profession that allows for that, then it's going to be a continuous individual endeavor that's going to burn people out.
Thank you for that, Rebekah. Our next question is not addressed to anyone in particular, and it comes from Charles McKinney. What are the first steps in creating a freedom school? My colleagues and I at Rhodes College want to enter into the fray. Any insights would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I'll take that. Charles and I went to grad school together, so fair recognition. But, you know, one of the things, you know, we have so much wisdom here, and, you know, I would defer to my dear colleague, Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons, who was a freedom school teacher, in Mississippi, during the height of the movement. One of the things that I have been privileged to do is to help kind of start workshops and curricula outside of mainstream education in different parts of the country. And what I like to do here is just, echo what Rebekah just said, which is you begin with the idea of humility and being humble and being vulnerable. It's so hard now as a teacher because you feel like you're always on the spot. If your principal doesn't have your back and you're isolated, you're an individual, you have to be the expert. But giving up that, surrendering that and getting out into a community of struggle, it's possible to do. I've seen it happen. But finding a movement organization that's already doing some good work is a good place to do it. Trying to start something from like the grassroots is always a challenge, but it can be done. What we've learned in terms of thinking about this network of people who are constantly called to do this kind of work is to really just listen first. What is it that people need? What do they say they need? And I'm not good in that one, Charles, because I love to talk. I just can't, when I start talking about history, I just can't shut up. But the most important thing is when we leave the campus or the classroom is looking, is listening. And what is it that the community really needs and desires and wants? And then what I've learned from Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons and other women who were incredible teachers in the Freedom School movement is, again, echoing something Rebekah said earlier about being vulnerable, realizing the community is keeping you alive, realizing there's so much knowledge in people who normally are not granted agency to have that knowledge.
And Charles, I just want to say, one, it's great to see you here. Two, just quickly, some of the resources that you can call on. And we have a network an embryonic network among the Freedom Schools in New Jersey. We would be happy to talk with you. James Anderson at the University of Illinois has, I think, a Freedom School there that he has helped to start. And I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about embedding a Freedom School in a university that way. And of course, you can always go to Crystal Clemens Moore at Children's Defense Fund. She'd be happy to put her team onto you. And it's a great team. So and there's some other resources that we can connect you to. So lots of us would like to have that conversation. Ahmad?
Yes.
Maybe two more questions.
All right. So the next question comes from Sonia Olivia. She says, you discussed the centrality of art, visuals, etc. What role do you think recent films such as Wakanda Forever will play in solidarity movements?
I haven't seen the film yet, but a lot of my students have seen it and they've been very inspired. And I think that's one of the important things about film is just the inspiration, the power of watching a story on screen. I haven't seen Till yet either. And I'm thinking about having my class go to see it as a class. Because I think that, but I'm thinking more too also about, and I'm excited to see the film, don't get me wrong, but poetry has really become very important for the work that we're doing. What I mean by this is that if you look at someone like Martina Espada, who won the National Book Award a couple of years ago, there's a slide I was going to show I didn't quite get to, but it's a poem he wrote about slavery, the Holocaust, and the Spanish conquest of the Americas in one poem. And there's so much poetry like that, especially coming out of Puerto Rico, a small place that has traditionally big ideas. Matt Cedillo's Chicano poetry in Los Angeles, so much of his work is about the struggles of Chicanos, African Americans, Asian Americans to survive the mean streets of Los Angeles. And I just think that those expressive cultures are more important than ever. We're kind of rediscovering kind of the early radical roots of Puerto Rican, Chicano, Black hip hop, and graffiti and breakdancing as they came out of these kind of rough neighborhoods like Vance Street, where we still have a house in Houston. People say, why do you have a place in Vance Street? Man, that is the roughest neighborhood in this country. But we're trying to encourage the kind of public arts movement in the US that Mexico, again, to me is a model for. My dear friend Matt Cedillo just has been sending me these photographs from Mexico City. He's saying, Paul, did you know that they've updated these murals? I'm like, yeah, man, it's just so exciting. So again, I'll kind of stop right there. Again, I haven't seen Wakanda, but it gives you an idea to me of how we can be inspiring.
Thank you, Professor Ortiz. So at this time, we will ask one final question from the chat. And this question comes from Crystal Chambers. In light of anti-Black racism coming out of LA recently, Dr. Ortiz, please address the contemporary relevance of Black and Brown solidarity.
Well, it's more important than ever, because the way that racism works in this country is, in the statements that were made, and let's be clear, I mean, these were vicious anti-Black, anti-Indigenous statements that were made. And unfortunately, I was traveling during this example. But what I think needs to happen is for us to think about, let's stop playing the zero-sum game of citizenship, of resources, of politics. I mean, I grew up in a society where constantly people were saying, look, if one group is getting anything, then the other group is losing out. And one of the things I argue in my work is we've got to stop the zero-sum game of citizenship like dead in its tracks. What I mean by this is that there's this idea that is being taught to our children, even to this day, that if Charles Payne gets more rights, then I have less. Or if Rebekah Cordova enjoys more opportunities, I have less opportunities. We've got to get out of that game. And we've got to use the Freedom School idea. This is one of the brilliant parts of the Freedom School movement, as I understand it, teaching that we all can be free, but we've got to get there together. And that's the idea that I'm trying to get across. I'm frequently asked to come in and speak to neighborhood organizations about coalition building, for example. But the first question I ask is, what do you know about your own neighborhood history? What do you know about your own people's history? And if they don't know that much, I'm like, start there. I'm thinking of Frantz Fanon's Register of the Earth. You've got to start someplace. But you don't end there, but you've got to start there. And then that's when you can learn how to reach out. I think a lot of it, and my friends in psychology are going to just kill me for this, but a lot of this goes back to a term we used to use in the 60s, but we stopped using in deference to our colleagues in psychology, and that term is self-hatred. There's a lot of self-hatred still in my family, in communities I grew up in. And as long as you have that idea that our people didn't do anything, our people should be embarrassed, we've got all the good things from the Anglos, and that's still prevalent. As long as you have those ideas in your head, remember that phrase, get the man out of your head, right? There's a reason people use the phrase. As long as we have that voice in our head, we'll never be able to be in solidarity with each other. And that's, to me, that's part of the work of liberation.
Actually, I'm going to sort of give an official close now, an official final thank you to Paul and Rebekah. If there are a few folk who want to stay online for a few moments, and if Paul and Rebekah, you have another few minutes, and maybe we'll do that. But I know some folk feel an obligation to stay until the end, so I want to give them permission to go. But I'm glad that you ended where you ended, with a point about self-hatred, because one of the things that bothers me a little bit about the construction of much of the conversation is there's been a tendency to kind of naturalize, or questions from the chat kind of set us back on a different path. There's been a question to kind of naturalize cross-group solidarity, right? To sort of make it sound as if that's the normal pattern. I don't know, it's complicated. Common oppression can generate solidarity, can also generate a sense of competition and a need to dominate the other side. All of those things, I mean, going back to what Rebekah said about the specifics of the situation, right? And a way in which it can push us in one direction or the other, but also back to the idea that we absorb dominant narratives like everybody else absorbs dominant narratives, right? And often we may turn those against one another or against ourselves inside the group. And so the example I just want to put on the table, coming from another Duke historian, as you guys know, is that as I think of it to be 1968, after King's assassination, the Poor People's March that he was planning goes forth, an interracial movement of the poor. The behavior of King's lieutenants and his staff was so close to racist in the way in which they interacted with every other group, right? They sent not all of them, obviously, but they sent a very clear message that we, the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, are professional activists, and all of you other people are very much second-class citizens in our movement, right? And the anger from that lasted a long time. It's just so ironic that the Black Panther Party did a much better job with cross-racial interactions and solidarity than the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Just check that off. So that example, just because it's a part of this history, right? The failure of people who were working with Dr. King to have learned from their own oppression, right? Not to become the oppressor, right? That failure it's a glaring example. So anyway, I just want to say that. By way of closing, all I'll say tonight is it's just great to be back in this community and in this conversation. There were times as recently as Monday when I wasn't sure how much of this was going to be allowed in this America. It has been a while since we've come together, and we'll talk later about how much the Freedom School conversation in the nation has changed. That word, that phrase, those ideas are much more in the public eye now. I will say that the Black Legislative Caucus in New Jersey, or at least some members of it, put aside $1 million from the state budget for freedom schools, right? And that's going to be an ongoing conversation. So it's funny as so much repression is going on, but as you were saying about Florida, there's also space to do things that are potentially liberating. So finally, I will just say something about where we will be going for the next couple of events. I think everyone heard Nikifa say at the beginning that we had a lot of requests to say more about what curriculum can look like. One of the things that's absolutely clear is that a liberating curriculum has to address issues of gender and the gender constructions that kids are socialized, that we're all socialized to have. So our next presentation, which I think is early January, is going to be about Project Daniel, which grew out of the concern of young Black ministers in Chicago about boys getting caught up in street violence, and that responded with a curriculum that takes biblical Daniel's exile in Babylon and uses that as an analog for the exile of Black boys in this country, and combines that with the Nguzo Saba. And we have a curriculum, right, that tries to bring boys into a different level of reflection. After that, we will have a Newark program that all of us Newarkers are just so damn proud of, right? She Wins, which is just wonderful young woman's empowerment program here, right? It is just a joyous, celebratory space, and we will have the program director, and I'm sure some of her students will be talking. After that, we're going to be having what I think of as the grandmother or the grandfather of freedom schools right now, 600 some kids. Brotherhood Sister Soul from New York, serving self-consciously, deliberately, intentionally serving a Dominican and an African-American population right between Harlem and Washington Heights, right? there are rites of passage programs and there are rites of passage programs, but their rites of passage programs are 4 to 6 years long, right? Working with the same groups of kids. They do just spectacular work. And at the center of the curriculum, and what I've long admired about them is they make young folk examine what they mean by man or woman and why they are attached to those particular constructions. So that's going to be one of the themes that we'll be talking about. Paul just let me know, although Zahara had let me know a few days ago. Zahara, I believe, is online. Zahara Simmons was the key part of the first panel that we did on Freedom Schools in the series. She and Michael Simmons have a book coming out, and both of them were deeply involved in the Black liberation struggle, right, for decades, right? So this is going to be, I'm sure, a wonderful book, and there may be an opportunity for us to do an event around that, perhaps in February, but we'll certainly do something around that conversation. We have some other things that are shaping, but obviously there is a lot to talk about, and more people are becoming parts of these conversations. So there's 2 days after the election, there's a little bit of hope, both in the country and among us, and among some of us who are trying to think about how we reimagine education for disenfranchised communities. So again, thank you, and good night. And if there were any final questions, for those of you who want to stay, do I see any? Ahmad, Marquise, did we have any that we did not get to?
No, we answered everything.
Okay, that's fine then. Okay.
Amazing. How often do we do that?
Yeah, I'm gonna say, but they were really good questions tonight too, and challenging questions. All right, you guys, take care. Paul, Rebecca, thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thanks for making it a wonderful experience, and the work that you all are doing. Just let us know what we can do to support it in Florida, and we'll be there for you.
Okay, well, we'll absolutely do that. And if we can do a joint project of some kind with Zahara, I think that would be, you said February then.
Yes. Now we have, and we'd be happy, if you wanted to co-sponsor, Charles, because so the event it's going to be February 23rd. Dan Berger is flying down. I think that Dan is, he may be doing some events further in the state. But yeah, the evening of February 23rd, around Zohar is still on. Zohar, do you remember the time? It's 5 or 6.
And can you put because I don't think you can actually speak.
We just gave her the opportunity to speak. So
Oh, wonderful.
I'm unmuted. Yes. Greetings, everyone. And thank you so much, Charles, for mentioning the book. And thank you, Paul, for mentioning that we're doing an event here in Gainesville on the 23rd. I do not remember the time either, but we certainly can. I know you can get that information to them. Why am I thinking it was 6 to 8, but I wouldn't swear to that.
Don't worry about that, because do you remember the title of the book? Can you do that?
Yes. We do have the title of the book. Zahara, do you want to give the title?
You caught me flat-footed.
Okay.
Isn't that something? What is it? Of course,
Okay,
it hasn't come out yet, so I don't have a copy. I do have the manuscript somewhere around here, which I went over with a fine-tooth comb.
State on Freedom.
State on Freedom, yes.
And I will put the URL in the chat so you can check out the advance copy.
Yeah, we've gotten some great reviews. I've just been stunned because I never thought this was going to happen. So this is a shock to me still.
Well, you remember you introduced Michael to our students in Mississippi. I think it was in Indianola, wasn't it? And all of a sudden, here's Michael Simmons there.
Yes, yes. And of course, I told Dan Berger, I said, you'll never get a publisher. We're nobodies. So I was wrong, but yes,
Basic books.
yeah, basic books.
Yeah, that's
Can't
quite a
believe it.
publisher.
Yeah.
But part of what I think is exciting is that you both have such long histories of struggle
That's
and in
what
such a
Dan
variety of
said.
organizations. And yeah, I know this language is probably too simplistic, but from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement,
Yes.
and both of you, strong architects of the theoretical thinking behind Black Power. That in and of itself is quite a history without all the other things that you did. So I just think it's going to be a great learning device.
So we'll get the exact time and everything to you, Charles, and it'll be a hybrid event. So yeah, we'd love to do, the co-sponsorship, and, help get the word out. And I know Dan is going to be an extended, book tour. We'll do a book signing and everything.
It sounds great. It sounds great.
Hey, Professor McKinney, great to hear from you. I saw Sandy Darity too.
Yes, great to hear from him. And he corrected you. He downloaded the chat because he had something he wanted you to see about Du Bois.
Okay, he's always he's always correcting me.
I'm telling you,
I always learn from him.
get used to it.
Exactly. No, I've been used to it. We've had many car rides where he's had a good educational impact. You said he put a comment in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure.
And I think it had to do with just pointing out that Du Bois gave up on the idea of voting at some point in his life.
Oh yeah.
And he gave a reference for that.
Yeah, he gave a link to an article about it, or
Okay,
to Du Bois's words about it.
Okay, very good. So I just copied and pasted the whole chat thing, but yeah, Sandy he used to take me around Durham all the time. I mean, his concerts and everything. And yeah, I haven't been to Durham because of the pandemic. I just got back there in October for the Hispanic Heritage Month, keynote. And so, but we didn't have a chance. I was going to try to have dinner with him and Kirsten. We just didn't have a chance to get together. But this is really great. So Sohar, I haven't seen you in a long time. I'm seeing you now in New Jersey space, even though we're both in Gainesville. So that's good.
Both of you in Gainesville.
Yeah.
Okay, folks.
All right.
It was a good evening. Thank you very much for
Yes. Thank you very much, Al. Have a good
All
night.
right. Be well, everyone.
All right. You too.
Good night, everyone.
All right.